Good evening to you, Professor Jen here. Seminar on Sexual Violence, week number 4, lecturecast. Thank you for letting me into your world to discuss these very intimate subjects as we roll along in this course, finding new things out through the readings and discussion. I must say, some very vibrant discussion. Because it is Holy Week and Passover for so many of us, and just sunshine for those of us who don't celebrate anything, I posted all of the week's work because I know Friday's Good Friday and some of you are leaving town. So I thought I'd get that all out to you, and I did the same thing for Women in Crime in the event that you're in both classes. So good evening to you and welcome for those of you who are celebrating Passover, Holy Week, or you're just so damn happy the sun shines out. I'm with you. I got quite a few questions this week into my email, which I was happy to hear from so many of you. If I keep looking away, it's only because I'm looking at my notes. And many of you have asked me to discuss a variety of subjects, and it's almost like a call-in show. You said, Professor Jen, could you please discuss some of these issues, as I'm curious on your thoughts, since we're discussing these very important readings and a lot of you are getting into the discussion of the films. So I thought I'd share with you some of my responses. And so many of you have asked me, about 50% of you have asked me about how does one comport themselves and move on with their lives, whether it's their religious life or their employment or their personal relationships after an attack. And I want to discuss religion first, because certainly we're in a very holy week and a very important place in history for so many religions at this time. And I speak only for myself personally, so, of course, this isn't any kind of big discussion about theology, etc., but you've asked me the question, so I'm happy to answer it for you. One person framed it so beautifully for me in the chat, as well as in a separate discussion from so many of you, asking me, does your faith get rocked or changed after a particular incident or occurrence or sexual attack? And of course it does. Just like when you have people in the service who go off to war, very often their experience and their mindset changes about what has happened to them, and therefore all of their religious beliefs then become questioned or they become challenged. Very often, I keep readjusting the camera, so please pardon me. Very often, when people find themselves in a war situation, combat situation, they go in maybe sometimes not having any religion, and they wind up finding a religion because of the extreme circumstances that they have witnessed while they were in combat. It can also work the opposite. People go in with very heavy and very strongly influenced religious feelings, and then after what they see in combat, they leave feeling nothing. Or they question their belief system altogether. Very often, many people think to themselves, especially as noted in the Holocaust and Bosnian war camps for sexual abuse, certainly the walking boys of Somalia, and just other horrible atrocities in history. People have said, well, if there is a God, where was he, or in some cases she, when all this was occurring? Very often when people become victims of sexual violence, they too ask these questions if they have a strong religious belief. Where was God when this was happening to me? Where was this higher power? And how did he or she, they, it, whatever it is somebody believes, how did this person allow this to happen to me? Most people do go through something like this. Or sometimes it's the opposite. People even feel if they've been spared and they were able to live and survive against horrible odds, sometimes if they started with no religion, they sometimes walk out thinking, well, there must have been a God because I should have been dead by now. And so sometimes in very horrible circumstances, people do find faith. So it can really work both ways. Many of you have asked me what my personal feelings are about my own faith and how I feel in light of what has happened to me, which I've shared with you in my lecturecast and certainly in chat. And this is honestly how I see it. I sometimes think to myself, of course, if there was a God, why did these things happen to me? And how could he or she or it, whatever this higher power is, let me have gone through these things? I guess what annoys me the most in my personal journey, having survived this circumstance for many years now, is the fact that I cannot take platitudes. I can't stand it when people say to me, well, out of something good comes something, so out of something bad, usually something good follows. That's not necessarily true. Sometimes just really bad things happen to people and nothing good comes out of it whatsoever, and I've accepted that. Sometimes people often say, well, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. No, some things are just going to kill you, and they don't make you stronger, and sometimes they make you even weaker. And so it really depends on who you're asking and what the circumstance is, but usually these platitudes make the person who's saying them feel a lot better than the victim themselves, though most people are certainly well intending. When people are attacked at a work situation, which happens very often, more often than people realize, most people are attacked. 81% roughly, pardon me, I have a little itch in my eye. 81% of persons that are attacked, that report, are usually attacked by somebody that they knew. So there's this heavy sense of betrayal. If you're attacked at work, in the military, which is work, if you're attacked at a dorm, among people that you know, people you go to high school with, it's very hard to return to that community if you can return at all. In a particular film so many of you have seen, Jaffa, spelled Jaffa, but in Hebrew as in Spanish we don't pronounce the J. It even addresses the fact that even after a violent attack has occurred in that family, they just up and move because it's just easier to start all over again and relocate sometimes than having to make something fit and make something redo. Sometimes, in some circumstances, you can't redo something that has happened. So, very often, many victims attempt to just find something new for themselves. Sometimes, if it's an attack that happened at work, they either ask for a transfer or they just wind up leaving the job because they can't take going there every day. In my personal life, as many of you have asked, I do have family members that I haven't seen in many, many years and that we just really have no relationship whatsoever. Do I wish it was another way? Of course I do. Is it too painful for them because they stood by and did nothing and they have to live with themselves? Maybe, I don't know. Maybe I'm just a reminder to them in some ways that I ruined their fantasy family life and I sort of jeopardized the way they remember our history together. I was just speaking this weekend with somebody who is definitely a survivor and had survived some horrific circumstances in their family and community and was the victim of sexual abuse as well as physical abuse, and the entire community knew. And I had had lunch with her, and she was really a very captivating woman, and definitely in my age group, somewhere between 48 and maybe 55 years old. And we were talking about how there's really no aftercare, even for people your age, traditional college age, that come out that they've been abused. Where is the aftercare long term if it's a family member? And what kind of therapy is there in aftercare? Because we have immediate care, which has to do with rape kits and antibiotics and general health issues. We have immediate care for psychological issues, and usually most health insurance expires that care after 6 months. What do we do with long-timers like myself? And this is something that we're just addressing as we're addressing vicarious trauma and a lot of other circumstances in psychology, sociology, anthropology, because women in my generation, the the tail end of the baby boomers, they really aren't used to coming out and talking about sexual abuse, and that includes men too. So please forgive me that I started the sentence with women, men as well. And we're in a very interesting quandary because this aftercare takes a very long time, if not the person's entire lifetime. I'll give you some examples. I have a little itch here, excuse me. Very often, people who survive some just very tragic elements of sexual abuse and being beaten and or raped and emotionally abused and just frightened, they live in a constant state of what we call hypervigilance. I would suggest you look that up sometime. And people also that are in combat and paramilitary environments suffer the same exact kind of symptoms. And these PTSD symptoms will follow you for the rest of your life. And we're beginning to find out in research that though you can mitigate many of the symptoms, especially at the very beginning, that usually immobilize and debilitate victims, they can be sort of eradicated. That's my little dog Meadow behind me. I guess she wants to be on television tonight. We found that the long termers like myself, through various studies, never get over what has happened to them. And so they suffer a series of issues. And I wanted to give you a few of those issues, and I do have some of them. Not all of them, thank God, but there are some people that do. Let's not be embarrassed as we have this discussion, as we're having an academic discussion and forum. If we can't speak honestly about these issues, then there's no point in taking or teaching these classes. So what I'm about to say shouldn't embarrass anybody, as it's an honest conversation, and apparently Meadow over there wants to be part of it. Men report after a sexual abuse that are in my age range, the long-termers now that we don't really know what to do with, that they often wind up with erectile dysfunction at a very early age, meaning in their 30s. Either they can't hold an erection or they wind up completing their sexual gratification very quickly because they just have no desire or interest in maintaining intimacy. It's too painful for them and it's a trust issue. Men also report a continuous feeling of enuresis when they have been victimized, meaning that they wind up feeling as though that they have a lot of pressure and they need to go to the bathroom to expel urine, but there really is no urine there in which to expel. Women also discuss those same two issues, that the sexuality issue of being able to enjoy themselves and feel comfortable with their partner changes, and also this business with the enuresis and the frequent bladder trips that really don't exist. In the very early persons, uh, the children especially, that wind up victims of sexual violence, very often they go into their adolescent years and their early 20s and 30s and 40s, we are now finding out. See, it's a whole new, it's amazing. It's a whole new area of study and research that we just don't have the data, but we find that they have self-reported, especially the women, that they have a hard time dealing with their menstrual cycle and they have a hard time keeping their private area very clean. In other words, let's not be embarrassed. Women usually in their private grooming, and men need to know this if you're ever going to have children and you have girls, you never wipe back back to front, you wipe front to back. Very often after women have had their privacy and their body abused at a very young age, wind up that their personal hygiene and their self-care is usually not what it should be, because either they use the fact that they're not cleaning themselves very well as a way to deter future violations, or it's just that they're so ashamed of what has happened to them that they're not self-grooming and self-managing in a way that's careful. So what happens is women then wind up with a lot of yeast infections, and they wind up with a lot of very painful bacterial infections, etc., and problems certainly with the urethra. That would be the urinary tract tube, that catches a lot of bacteria. Now that can go the flip side too, and I have this in my case, if I may. I hope that I'm not embarrassing you, but like I say, sometimes education is really boils down to discussing these issues, and I'm not ashamed or embarrassed to discuss with you some of my little quirks, as they're not overly personal, but they do serve a purpose. I do find that in my personal grooming habits, I probably change my underwear more than most people do, and that's probably I constantly have this feeling that I'm never clean enough. At one point in my life, when I was college age, in fact, several of my college roommates had remarked now, because back then we could never have discussed these things. In the 80s, it still wasn't an atmosphere where you could come out with what has happened to you. They remarked that they couldn't understand. They thought I was partly reptilian because I was constantly in the shower. One roommate told me that I was sometimes in the shower 3 to 4 times a day. So I guess I was suffering tremendously with whatever it was that was bothering me from circumstances that had happened to me at least a decade before. I'm happy to report I'm in the shower once a day now, sometimes twice, but not 3 and 4 times a day in the shower. I also have spoken to other victims, and they too have some very significant issues in dealing long term with what has happened to them. Uh, Not only do they question their faith, they question their judgment. They live in a state of hyper vigilance. They always wonder if they asked for it. Um, they live sort of a little restrained. Maybe they're willing to share a lot of things, but they're not willing to share certain aspects of their intimacy. There are some persons that have shared with me that they can only have sexual gratification through masturbation, even though they might have partners that they're in love with. They just can't seem to have that trust level where they can share that level of intimacy with somebody else. And this happens to men, women, heterosexual, homosexual, transgender, whatever. It really knows no particular gender. It's just really a byproduct of what happens to people. Another place where I find my own little crazy from what's happened to me is I also notice that I don't like to sit with my back to any doorway unless the doorway is locked. It's, I guess, a safety issue. I like to see really who's coming at me, and I'd rather know than not know. So even if I go out to a public place, I usually don't have my back to the door. I usually like to sit in the catbird seat, so to speak, to see who's coming at me. What's always really surprised me, so many of you have asked me this question after having what happened to me become such a prevalent part of my life and my career choice. How could I ever work among murderers and rapists and persons who are extremely violent and be locked up with them all day and sort of come to terms with what happened to myself? And my answer is this: for some reason, I guess it never really bothered me because at least I knew exactly who it was that I was with all day. Whereas in my personal life, in my personal case, the person who was really very inappropriate with me happened to have been my stepfather. And here that was the person I trusted, etc., and my family trusted. And that was the person who attacked me. So here, I guess, working in facilities, I always felt that I would never let my guard down because I already knew what was there. Whereas my stepfather, I really didn't see what was happening to me until it really began to happen to me because his grooming efforts, and I say grooming, Grooming, his grooming efforts started when I was about 11 years old, and that was roughly in the 1970s. I don't even think we had the word grooming until the 1990s. So we didn't even realize what was happening, from an academic standpoint. So a few of you, like I say, have asked me, how do people begin again? Sometimes in 12-step programs, that would be AA, NA, SA for Sexual Anonymous, Sex Addicts Anonymous. and Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous. Sometimes all these 12-step programs, which I am a fond believer in and a firm believer in, they work for most people. Um, Sometimes they tell you that you can go to a certain point in your recovery and then you have to really start all over again. Art therapy, I found in my own personal sense of self, and my creative outlets have helped me immensely. And of course, helping others, whether it's academically through our forum or working directly with survivors as well, has helped me tremendously because I see sometimes more hope in them than I even see in myself. Sounds sort of sad when you say it that way, but that's really how I feel. Because at least I see with the new victims that are evolving that at least they're not sort of hovered off into a dark corner wondering what just happened and should I say something and shouldn't I say something. We do still see that, but it's not as frequent as the people in my age range. Today, people are much more apt to come out and talk about what happened to them. I'll leave you with a brief story before I go, as this is Holy Week for many of you, and it's Passover for me, and I need to go about my business and celebrate my holiday. But I had years ago a woman who was in jail. She was an interesting lady. She had no paper on her. She was never in jail before or prison, and she was in her 60s. She looked like she could be anybody's grandma, and she was very refined and certainly very well read and educated. And I had said to her, "Why are you sitting in jail?" Because she really didn't fit the usual criteria, and I had no idea why she was sitting in there. Apparently, she had gone on a stealing spree for no reason whatsoever. She had the money to pay for her items at Wegmans and she was stealing groceries and she wasn't having a personal food shortage problem. And she kept stealing and stealing and stealing and stealing. Finally, I was referred to her. And the stealing, her continuous stealing with ability to pay, wound up landing her in jail for 36 days. She never had a record and never did this behavior before. And I had said to her, we'll just call her Shirley for our purposes. I said, Shirley, I said, what is this with the stealing? You have no history of this. You have no history of any criminal offense. What's the problem? And she said to me, I don't know if I can tell you. I said, well, you're going to try very hard because I was sent to speak with you and perhaps there's something I can do to help you. And she said to me, well, she said, I'll tell you. And it took her about 10 minutes just to even find the words. And it's a long time, 10 minutes. If I sat here for 10 minutes, which I won't, but it would be a long time if I sat here and stared at you in this lecturecast and tried to describe a red bouncing ball to you and took 10 minutes, it would almost be painful, you know? And she said to me, she kept repeating over and over again, I just don't know how to say this. I just don't know how to say this. And this went on for 10 minutes. And I could see the pain in her face. And then she finally said to me, when I was 12 years old, I was raped by my uncle. And I never addressed it with a soul. Because in my generation, meaning the generation that precedes me, she was old enough to be my mother at the time, she said, I just didn't know who to go to. She said, and the other day she said, I read in the obituary that he had passed away. She said, and I feel like going out and stealing some more because I'm so angry. She said, and when I steal, I get an adrenaline rush, so therefore I feel better. So follow me on this. Shirley was busy stealing because she was already in her 60s, never got the right amount of help as there was nowhere to go for what her uncle did to her. Then while she's in jail, she's reading the obituaries and see that he's passed on. And now she feels like getting out in 30-something days and stealing some more. I said, Shirley, you have to find another way to manage your anger. And she said something that I wasn't prepared for. She said, Jennifer, I don't even know how to be angry. She said, your generation knows how to be angry. She said, I was born in the 1940s, and growing up in the 1950s and 60s, women were taught to be pretty, polite, perky, and go find themselves a husband. And that's when I realized that in Shirley's case, she really had nowhere to go. And I guess in Shirley's case, I'm not speaking for her, but it was a culmination of all of these decades of these unresolved, horrific issues that she couldn't deal with. Therefore, I'm not saying I agree with the stealing, but I understand where she was coming from. She had no way to get this out. I had one other lady that was similar at the time, 10 years ago. She was in her 50s. She'd now be in her 60s, where Shirley would be in her 70s. And this woman had said to me that she would get so angry at herself because she felt she allowed what happened to her. She was sexually abused not only by her brother, but her brother's friends when she was a child. She had shared with me, secretly, whispering in jail, as if it was some big secret that I'd never heard of before, that she was cutting and biting and picking at herself, scabbing herself, is what she called it. And she really felt that she was the only person on this earth that ever did that. So she had like a double set of shame. The first shame was that she was raped and assaulted by her brother, then his friends, and then here throughout her life, up until her 50s, into her 60s, I assume, she was scabbing and cutting. And I said to her, I don't mean to ruin this ambiance for you, but you're not the only person who does that. There are plenty of people who do this. And because they can't take the amount of emotional pain that they're in, so they deflect the pain by causing other self injurious behavior on their person. She was so shocked that I told her this while we were sitting in jail. So shocked. By the way, she was in there for writing bad checks. Never had a history of any jail, crime, or anything. She just couldn't take her circumstances anymore and started to act out. She was so shocked that other people did these things, the cutting, the slashing. She would tell me that she would pick little backs of her neck, little parts back here or back behind her ears. And she said that she would constantly pick and pick and pick and pick because nobody could see it other than her. And she had long hair like I do, so a lot of people really couldn't see it. But she said that she would cause herself really such injury to the point where it would scab and then she'd pick it over and it would scab and she would pick it over. And she said at least that amount of pain she could control, where what was going on up here, she had no sense of control. So I was happy to share these examples with you, as so many of you had asked me to speak about this. And if you have things you would like me to speak about in the lecturecast, we will have, of course, trying to do the math. I'm a little tired from my Passover festivities. We'll have about 6 more lecture casts. So if there's anything you'd like me to touch upon, you'll put it in the chat room with Professor Jen. Could you please speak specifically on this topic, as it's something that interests me, and I would like firsthand information if you have it, either from your own experience or the experience of others that you've listened to and continue to listen to. So I leave you in this holy week, whatever it is, or just week of spring, always wishing each of you the best, wishing you the most out of life, finding some renewal in spring, and finding a fresh perspective. I thank you for letting me come into your virtual world. I also thank Captioning Services for everything they're doing for us and bringing all of our worlds together. I wish you a good night always. Always stay safe. Always be well. And have a very, very nice week. Happy holidays. Good night.